Thank you. Thank you so much. Oh, hello. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here. Can you all hear me okay? Awesome. So thank you for that lovely introduction. I don't need to tell you much more about myself, but what I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about some general lessons that I've learned from doing engaged scholarship and engaging with a variety of students at CSU in the realm of environmental justice, and how we can use that to combat climate anxiety and eco grief. And I'm talking about that today because this is something that I run across in almost every student I teach and in almost every community member that I interact with, regardless of how mobilized or engaged they are. There's a sense of climate grief and paralysis that may come along with that. And so instead of talking about a particular project today, I wanted to talk about some of the lessons that I've learned from these kinds of engaged scholarship over the last few years. To get us started though, I'd like to know, and we can just shout them out, what one word, not shout them, yell them, what one word is that expresses how you feel about climate crisis today. Freaked out. I heard freaked out, yeah. Hopeless. Yikes. Overwhelmed. Concerned. Stressed. Yes, so I think we can tell a theme here, right? There's anxiety, there's grief, there's concern. There might be so much overwhelm that you don't really know where to start in terms of addressing the issue. And as an environmental sociologist, I've come across this quite a bit, right? So before we get into climate grief and solutions to it, or ways to mobilize folks, I want to talk a little bit about what environmental sociology is, because we have such a multidisciplinary audience today. So as sociologists, right, we are studying institutions. A lot of folks think that we're studying like psychology and how people think, and that's a bit of it, but we're studying systems, right, and social structures, and how we can interact with those and create social change through them, right? So as an environmental sociologist, I look at the ways that our natural environment, of which we are a part, right, interacts with these social systems we've created, especially economic systems, because we tend to reify economic systems as if they are entities unto themselves and they're not social creations, right? We don't really think of them. I've been on a few economics committees for PhD students as an outside member, and it's really interesting to see that, right? And so as sociologists, we tend to study how societies and economies interact with the natural world, how resources, the good things like clean air, clean water, public transportation, and the bad things like pollution, toxics, hazards, how are all of those distributed in society? And who decides, right? Who has a seat at the table? And I'll talk in a moment about how those questions align with environmental justice. But we also look at the role power plays, we look at the role of institutional contexts, and my work in particular does this by getting into community, right? Working with community, often having community partners and engaging with community in that way so that we're asking questions that are of interest to the people that are helping us do this research, right? So for example, I have an ongoing study around the Suncor oil refinery outside of Denver. You've probably seen it. It's in Commerce City. As you drive down to Denver, you may have seen it. You may have been through Commerce City. And that's all in partnership with Cultivando, a local organization that has connected us with community and helped us determine what does community want to know, right? So this is an example of the kind of work that we might do. So I work on environmental and climate justice in particular. I work especially in the context of extractive industries, so unconventional oil and gas production. We do a lot of field work over in Weld County and up and down the Front Range, the Plains, as well as in Pennsylvania, and things around nuclear and uranium mining and milling, right? So for nuclear power and weapons making. In all of these contexts, I tend to look at environmental justice. And two key threads of this are distributive justice. So again, where do we put those good things and bad things? Who's overexposed to the bad things? But we also ask kind of the processual questions behind that, right? What does procedural justice mean? How can we have processes that get everyone at the table to help us think about how we use land, water, other relations, and how we might determine climate policies and actions, for example. And in this context, the environment, of course, right, we're part of it. We are part of nature, and so this includes the things that we build, right? Includes the built environment that the average American spends about 90% of their time in. I'm also a human being, though, and I'm a person who's very interested in intergenerational justice. I didn't talk about some elements of environmental justice that include restorative justice, recognition, justice. And all of this involves thinking about what we're leaving to future generations, right? And this is where we can hit some of that paralysis and that grief that we're talking about. Having a child only amplified these feelings, right? It was very real for me and being an educator and a researcher, but when I had a child and when I brought him home the day that the Cameron Peak fires started, it became very real that our radical act of hope, right? We finally decided we can bring a kid into this crazy world. It's gonna be okay, bring him home, and we have ash falling from the sky on us, right? It made it really impossible to ignore, and I felt like I was really paralyzed for a moment in time. And this is when I really started to search, as I was working on a book at the time, how do we find hope? Because I had taught too many students that lost that by the time we were halfway through a semester, if not already came into the classroom feeling like that. So climate or eco-grief, I want to take a moment to define and describe what this is, right? This is deep existential grief that we feel in the face of massive losses or the anticipation of them. We can feel layered impacts and losses. And we have, our most recent research shows that at least 64%, 65% of Americans are worried about this. But if you look at the age group between 16 and 24, that is nearly all of the folks that we've polled in that age group feel a lot of climate anxiety and despair. And it's because, and we see these patterns internationally, right? And it's largely because this can be experienced as disenfranchised grief. So there's little social acknowledgement of the experiences that we're having. In the US and in other contexts, sometimes we can't even talk about climate emergency or climate crisis, even in professional settings where we're doing science around it. And folks often feel powerless, right? Because they feel few social supports and few ways of actually plugging in to the system and actually changing it, right? But we know that climate crisis is not here because of some accident. It's not a surprise. And when we look historically, we can understand what I'm talking about. So this headline from The Guardian, who does some more advanced work on US environmental policy than many US outlets because of our lack of environmental reporting. They're a really excellent source of information about this, right? And as they've highlighted, this comes from the Carbon Majors report, we can see that climate crisis is the product of 500 plus years of colonialism, ongoing settler colonialism, and industrialization that goes along with it, and rampant capitalism, especially neoliberal capitalism, that prioritizes markets over people and our planet, and that really prioritizes getting rid of as many rules about environmental well-being and social well-being as possible, right? So we have seen in the last 40 years, under that system of neoliberal capitalism, we've lost half of all of our wildlife, and more industrial emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, have been created in the last 30 years than in all the years prior, going back to 1750. So the system in which we were embedded, right, this neoliberal capitalist system, is having some really important and rapid impacts. But once we understand the role of fossil fuels and the promise of seeing where this is coming from, right, we can focus our energy a little bit and our collective energy. When we recognize that 100 companies are responsible for about 71% of the global greenhouse gas emissions in the last 40 years, we can really understand where to focus our energy. And this is what brings me to an especially important antidote to climate despair and climate or eco-anxiety, right? And that would be working together and collective action. And this is because under neoliberalism, we also tend to think of ourselves only as individuals. Capitalism and American mythology has done that for hundreds of years, but neoliberal capitalism has really distilled this. And it's so successful in places like the US because it really resonates with our mythologies about being American. But once we start to use a sociological lens and an EJ approach, we can see the powerful effects of collectives. And in fact, joining collectives, now we have a lot of evidence that this is one of the most promising antidotes to those feelings of depression. And it's because climate change and the anxiety that goes along with it is a societal problem. It's not an individual problem, right? We feel this despair because our society is not doing anything to recognize climate crisis, at least at the COP28 starts today, right? Hosted by, well, I won't go into that, but you all have been paying attention, right? So we want to pay attention to how individuals can start to feel less stress and distress by becoming part of the collective. But what I've learned, right, as a sociologist is that we have to relearn our connections. And as a teacher in this area, I have to teach students almost every semester how to think of themselves as part of a collective. And I use aspen trees as an analogy, right, because they look very separate on the surface, but underneath we understand that they're connected by complex they're one organism, essentially, right? And this is a way that we can start to visualize how we have been trained to think as individuals, but we are always very much part of a collective. So after we relearn our connections to community, then we can build communities that move into coalitions, right? Where you have groups that organize with each other across difference of race or class or specific issue that they're working on. So in my research, one example of local coalition building has been in the oil and gas communities that I do a lot of work in. When I started doing work here in 2014, going into communities, there were many small organizations that were just starting to mobilize around a specific well pad or a problem in a neighborhood. And through our projects and my work with communities, I was able to go in and see over time and also encourage that these separate little organizations join forces because it allowed them to counter the scale of production and the connections that, that industry have with one another in terms of the scale of knowledge that they have about where well pads are, who signed leases, right? All of these things that we can't know as individuals. This is a photo I took from a Lighthawk flight just over in Weld County. So this is the kind of industrial activity, right, that's going on in the midst of residential areas and that folks organized against in coalitions. What we've seen through them is that active hope can combat climate grief, right? Active hope is becoming an active participant in bringing about the world we want and the change we need, but without a guarantee that it will actually happen, right? And Rebecca Solnit is an excellent writer in this area. Active hope was coined by Joanna Macy and Chris Johnstone, but Rebecca Solnit has also written extensively on hope. And one of the key points, right, is that we don't necessarily know if our actions will be successful, but that's not the point. The point is the connections that are made and working towards the world that we want to live in. So I'll leave you with the thought of how do we actually do this? We need examples of what we build. And I want to give two examples, one at the collective and one at the individual level. Kate Raworth's work, she's an Oxford economist, talks about how we get into that donut space, the just and safe space for humanity, by trying to build more distributive and regenerative systems. I encourage you to look at the website on this and some of the work that's done on this because it's very malleable, can be used at multiple scales. Cities like Amsterdam, for example, since the pandemic are rebuilding their economies around this model, but it's being done at multiple scales. At the individual level, you can start to think about, this is from Ayanna Johnson, it's her climate Venn diagram. This is the way to start thinking about where do we plug in given our individual talents? How do we actually plug into that collective that I'm talking about, right? Identifying what brings you joy, what you're good at, and what needs doing. And in the middle, you have your climate action that can help you figure out where to plug in. All right, I will leave it at that. Thank you so much.